She arrived with nothing but a worn satchel and a name nobody recognized. They hired her to cook. They expected her to stay quiet. What they didn't expect was that this 30-year-old woman, overlooked, underfed, and flat-broken, would be the only thing standing between Black Ridge Ranch and the man who wanted to burn it to the ground. By the time the smoke cleared, 3 men were in chains, a water channel dead for 40 years was running again, and everyone who'd ever looked past Clara Bennett was about to feel very, very foolish. Like and comment with the name of the city you're viewing so I know how far my story has come. And stay, because this story has only just begun. The wagon hit a rut so hard that Clara's teeth clacked together, and she grabbed the side rail with both hands to keep from sliding off the bench. The driver, a thick-necked man named Deeds, who hadn't said more than 12 words since picking her up in town, didn't even flinch. He just chewed whatever was in his cheek and kept his eyes on the trail ahead like she wasn't there. Clara let go of the rail, pressed her spine straight, looked out at the land. It was the kind of country that didn't apologize for itself. Flat in some places, then suddenly broken by dark ridgelines that rose out of the earth like old arguments. The grass was the color of straw and just as dry. Every creek bed they passed was cracked mud. The sky above was enormous and blue and utterly indifferent, and the sun sat high in it, hammering everything below without mercy. She'd been told Black Ridge Ranch was about 6 miles east of Harlan's Crossing. She'd been told it was a cattle operation with a full crew. She'd been told the work was cooking, 3 meals a day, and that the pay was steady. What she hadn't been told was that she could smell the trouble from a mile out. There was something about the way the range looked, not just dry, but defeated, like it had been trying for a long time and had finally given up. The fence posts along the trail leaned at odd angles. A water trough beside a holding pen was tipped on its side. The cattle she could see in the distance were thin in a way that went beyond the drought. They moved slow and kept their heads low. Clara had grown up on a working ranch in Kansas. She knew what healthy cattle looked like, and she knew what they looked like when something had gone wrong that wasn't just weather. These animals looked like they'd been losing for a while. The wagon crested a low rise, and the ranch house came into view. A long, low structure of weathered timber with a stone chimney at the far end. Behind it, a barn. To the left, a bunkhouse. A water tank on stilts, a tool shed, a small corral where 3 horses stood in the heat doing nothing. Deeds pulled up in front of the house and stopped the wagon without ceremony. "This is it," he said. Clara climbed down, her boots landing in dry dirt that puffed up around her ankles. She pulled her satchel after her and stood in the yard looking at the place. Up close, the house was in worse shape than it had looked from the rise. The porch boards needed replacing. One of the shutters hung at an angle. The whole thing needed paint. She heard boots on the porch before she saw him. Silas Mercer was not a large man, but he had a way of taking up space that had nothing to do with size. He was maybe 40, hard to say exactly. He had the kind of face that weather and work had carved into something older than it probably was. Dark hair shot through with gray at the temples. Eyes the color of old creek water, somewhere between brown and green and difficult to read. He wore a plain work shirt and canvas trousers and didn't bother with a hat. He came down the porch steps and stopped at the bottom, looking her over the way a man looks at a horse he's not sure he should buy. Clara looked back at him the same way. "You're Clara Bennett," he said. It wasn't a question. "I am." "You have ranch experience?" "I grew up on one. Worked cattle until I was 22. Did cooking after that, mostly for work camps and mining operations. I know how to feed men who are hungry and on their feet all day." Silas studied her for a moment. "Widow?" "No. Never married." "Family?" "None left." Something in his expression shifted, just barely. Not sympathy exactly, more like recognition. "My foreman Rand will show you the kitchen and the supply situation. Cook's quarters are behind the main house." He turned to go back up the steps. "Mr. Mercer?" He stopped. "What happened to the last cook?" He turned his head slightly, not quite looking at her. "Left." "Why?" The pause before he answered was a fraction too long. "Decided the work wasn't for her." He went inside without another word. Clara stood in the yard with her satchel and listened to the door close. Then she picked up her bag and went to find Rand. Rand Calloway was a raw-boned man in his late 30s with a weathered face and an easy manner that Clara figured was either genuine or very well practiced. He showed her the kitchen without much fanfare. It was a functional space, nothing more, with an iron stove that had seen better years, a long work table, shelves of dry goods that were more depleted than they should have been for a crew of 7. "How long since you've had regular supplies brought in?" Clara asked, studying the shelves. 3 weeks, Rand said. "Maybe 4. What happened?" He leaned against the doorframe. "The supplier in Harlan's Crossing cut us off, said the ranch account was in arrears." He said it matter-of-factly, like it was just another piece of bad weather. "Boss has been making arrangements with another outfit, but it takes time." Clara didn't ask how far in arrears. She'd seen enough struggling operations to know that question had a way of making men defensive, and she'd been on the job less than an hour. "I'll work with what's here," she said, "but I need a full inventory list by tonight so I know what I'm dealing with." Rand raised an eyebrow. "You're going to want a list." "I'm going to need a list." "There's a difference." She turned and started pulling items off the shelf, checking dates and quantities. "Tonight, before supper." "Please." He left, and Clara wasn't sure if he was amused or annoyed. She decided it didn't matter. Check. The crew came in for supper at 6, 7 men, counting Rand and Deeds. They filed in and took their seats around the long table in the main room and looked at the woman standing at the serving end of it with varying degrees of skepticism. One of the younger hands, maybe 19 with a shock of red hair and ears too big for his face, stared openly. "You're the new cook?" he said. "Last time I checked," Clara said, and set a pot of beans on the table. There was a beat of silence, and then the man next to him elbowed him quiet. The food was plain: beans, cornbread, salt pork, coffee, because plain was what the inventory allowed. But Clara had learned years ago that hungry working men didn't care about variety as much as they cared about quantity and heat. She kept the plates full and the coffee coming, and by the time the meal was done, the skepticism around the table had downgraded into something more neutral. All except one man. He was sitting at the far end, heavy-set with a thick mustache and small, appraising eyes. He hadn't said anything during the meal, just eaten and watched her, and when the others pushed back their chairs, he stayed where he was. "Mercer hired a woman cook," he said to nobody in particular. "After everything else, now this." "Folks eat," Clara said, collecting plates. "Doesn't much matter who does the cooking. It matters when the boss is scraping to make payroll and he's wasting coin on somebody who can't pull fence or ride out with the herd." "Then it's lucky you've got someone who can ride out and pull fence," she said pleasantly, "and someone else to make sure you come back to a hot meal." The man's eyes narrowed, but before he could say anything else, Rand appeared in the doorway. "That's enough, Burl," he said quietly. Burl stood up, shoved his chair in, and left without looking at Clara again. Rand waited until the room was clear. "Don't mind him." "I don't," Clara said, which was mostly true. "He's been here longer than anybody else. Takes it personally when things go wrong." "How long have things been going wrong?" Rand was quiet for a moment. He picked up his coffee cup, found it empty, and set it back down. "About a year," he said. "Maybe a little more." "And before that?" "Before that, Black Ridge was one of the better operations in this part of the territory." He said it with something in his voice that wasn't quite grief, but lived close to it. "Water was good, grass was good, herd was strong. Then the drought hit, and then the water started going bad, and then the cattle started dying, and then the money." He stopped. "Well, you see how it is." Clara looked at the empty table and the depleted shelves and the stove that needed a new firebox damper. "I see how it is," she said. "Chat." She didn't sleep well that first night. Her quarters were small: a cot, a washstand, a single window that looked out toward the barn, and the heat sat heavy even after dark. But it wasn't the heat keeping her awake. It was her mind, turning over the things she'd seen since arriving. The cattle too thin for drought alone. The shelves stripped in a way that didn't fit a simple supply interruption. The last cook who had decided the work wasn't for her. Burl, who took the ranch's failures personally. Rand's voice when he talked about the way things used to be. She'd spent enough of her life in places where things were quietly going wrong to recognize the feeling. It was a specific kind of tension, not just hardship, but something imposed. something that didn't fit the natural shape of bad luck. She'd learned that distinction from her father. Dale Bennett had been a rancher all his life, working a modest spread in southern Kansas until the land wore out. He'd had a methodical mind and a habit of walking a problem the way other men walked fence lines, slow and careful and looking at both sides. He'd taught Clara to read land and weather and animals, but more than that, he'd taught her to notice when a problem felt like accident and when it felt like intention. This felt like intention. She lay on the cot and listened to the quiet, the far-off low of cattle, the wind moving over the roof, the occasional creak of the bunkhouse, and told herself she was being suspicious without cause. She'd been there less than a day. She was tired. She was still raw from the hard months that had brought her to Black Ridge in the first place, the series of closures and bad luck and dwindling options that had eventually narrowed down to one answer: take the cook's job at a struggling ranch and figure out the rest later. Maybe it was just a struggling ranch. She closed her eyes, opened them again. Somewhere outside, past the barn, a horse snorted and stamped. Clara sat up. She wasn't sure why. Something in the sound was off, not frightened exactly, but alert. Horses made that sound when something moved in the dark that shouldn't be moving. She crossed to the window and looked out. The yard was still. The barn sat dark and quiet, its wide doors shut. The bunkhouse was dark. The main house was dark. But there was a smell. Faint, barely there, but real. Smoke. Eat. She was out the door before she'd fully decided to move. The smell was stronger outside. Not campfire smoke, not cook smoke. Something bigger and meaner, with a chemical edge to it. She crossed the yard fast, heading toward the barn, and she was 20 feet away when she saw the thin line of orange light coming from under the north wall. "Fire!" she shouted, and her voice came out loud enough to surprise her. "Fire in the barn! Everybody up!" She didn't wait to see if anyone heard her. She hit the barn doors and threw both of them open, and the air that came out was hot and smelled like burning hay. In the far corner, near the feed stalls, a stack of dry brome had caught. Not smoldering, actually burning, with a wall of flame already climbing the old timber beside it. 3 horses were in the stalls on the near side, and they were in a panic. Clara didn't think about it. She went straight to the first stall, unlatched the gate, and the horse, a bay gelding, shot past her so fast she had to press back against the wall. Second stall, third, both horses out and running for the open doors. By now she could hear shouting from outside, and the sound of men's boots hitting the ground. Light from lanterns. Rand's voice calling out orders. The fire in the corner had reached the main beam overhead. "Get the water line!" Rand was in the doorway. "Clara, get out!" There's a 4th horse. She could see it in the back stall through the smoke. She'd counted 4 horses when she arrived, and 3 were out. Back corner. Clara. She went low, under the smoke, and made it to the back stall. The horse inside was a gray mare who had pressed herself into the far corner, shaking hard, eyes white all around. Clara put her hand flat on the animal's neck and kept it there, kept it steady, kept her own breathing slow even though every instinct was telling her to run. "Easy," she said. "Easy. Come on." The mare tossed her head. Clara held on, walked her forward, kept the pressure on her neck even and firm. They came out of the stall into smoke that was getting thicker, and Clara couldn't see the doors anymore, but she could feel the air pressure shifting toward the opening, and she followed it, one hand on the horse's neck, one arm up over her own face. They came out of the barn into the night air, and the mare broke away and ran, and Clara stumbled and went down on one knee in the dirt. Someone grabbed her arm and hauled her up. She blinked through watering eyes and found herself looking at a face she didn't recognize, young, freckled, the red-haired kid from supper. "That was," he started. "Water," she said. "Where's the water line?" They fought the fire for an hour. It was ugly and chaotic, and at one point the north wall started to go, but Rand had 3 men on the hand pump and they managed to keep it contained. By the time the fire was out, the corner of the barn was black ruin, the beam had come down, and half the crew was coughing from smoke. Claire was sitting on a water trough, using a wet cloth on her arms, where the heat had found skin, when Silas came and stood in front of her. He looked at the barn. He looked at her. His expression was the same closed, difficult thing it had been when she arrived, but something behind his eyes had shifted. "You went back in for the mare," he said. "She was in there." That was stupid. Probably. He was quiet for a moment. "She's a good horse." "I know. I could tell by the way she was bred." Clara folded the cloth and set it on her knee. "Mr. Mercer, how did the fire start?" His jaw set. "Dry hay in summer." "That hay was stacked wet," she said. "I saw it when Rand showed me around. Wet stacked hay can spontaneous combust, I know that. But not in a corner like that. Not in a way that climbs the timber that fast." She looked at him steadily, and I could smell something in it, something beyond hay. "Lamp oil," Rand said. He'd come up behind Silas. His voice was flat. "I smelled it too soon as we hit the doors." Silas said nothing. "Has this happened before?" Clara asked. The silence that followed was its own kind of answer. "Some." In the morning, the crew assessed the damage. One section of the north wall would need to be rebuilt. The feed that had been stored in that corner, a significant portion of what they had, was ash. 3 men stood at the edge of the burned section, looking at it with the particular expression of people adding up a number and not liking the sum. Burl stood apart from the others with his arms crossed, looking out at the range. Clara watched him from the kitchen window while she made breakfast. He had that look again. Not grief, not worry. Something more specific. Something that looked like a man who had decided something and was waiting for events to confirm it. She thought about what Rand had said. He's been here longer than anybody else. Takes it personally when things go wrong. There were 2 ways to take something personally. You could feel it as your own loss, or you could feel it as the consequence of decisions you believed in. She wasn't accusing anyone of anything. She didn't have enough to accuse anyone of anything, but she filed it away, the way her father had taught her to file things, quietly, in order, waiting to see what shape they made. The days that followed fell into a pattern that Clara settled into with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned early that work was what kept the worst thoughts quiet. Up before dawn. Fire in the stove. Biscuits or cornbread, or on the days the flour situation was bad enough, hoe cakes from the last of the cornmeal. Coffee always, because a crew without coffee was a crew in a bad mood, and a crew in a bad mood made mistakes. She fed 7 men 3 times a day and learned their shapes along the way. Rand, who ate fast and thought slower than he wanted people to know. The red-haired kid, his name was Colby, who was 19 years old and so eager to be taken seriously that it came out the wrong way about half the time. A man named Pruitt, who had a bad left knee and walked with a slight drag and never complained about it, which made Clara respect him. 2 brothers named Cass and Tom, who communicated mostly by looks and were between them the most competent members of the crew. And Burl, who ate what she cooked and said nothing about it but found other ways to make his opinions known. Silas ate at the table with his men at supper but said little. He was up before Clara was, and out after dark. And in between he worked the operation the way a man bails a sinking boat, steadily, without pause, but always aware that the water was still coming in faster than it was going out. On the 4th day, Clara asked Colby to take her out to the southeast pasture. "Boss didn't say anything about," he started. "I want to look at the water situation," she said. "You've got a dry creek bed out there. I want to see it." He looked uncertain, but he got the horses anyway. The creek bed was cracked pale mud, every stone in it bone dry and bleached by the sun. It ran east to west along the edge of the pasture and then hooked north, which was, Clara knew, toward where the water table should have been at its shallowest. She walked the length of it slowly, studying the patterns in the dried mud, the way the cracks ran, the way the sediment had settled. "This used to flow year-round?" she asked. "Far as anyone remembers," Colby said. He was walking behind her, hands in his pockets. "Started going dry about 3 years ago. Boss says it's the drought." "Maybe." Clara crouched at a point where the creek bed curved against a low ridge. "But drought dries a creek from the bottom up. The sediment at the bottom gets thin, then the water gets low, then it stops." She ran her fingers along the bank. "This dried from the top. The flow stopped first, then it dried." She stood up. "Something stopped the water upstream." Colby looked uncertain. "What do you mean, stopped it?" I mean an obstruction, something blocking the channel before it gets here. She looked north toward where the creek bed continued. What's up that way? Past the ranch boundary? He shrugged. Old fence line from the Alderman property. Place has been empty 15, 20 years. Clara looked north for a long moment. The air was hot and dry and absolutely still. I want to see that fence line, she said. She didn't ask permission. She probably should have, but she'd learned that asking permission for the kind of thing she was thinking would generate more resistance than going and looking first and explaining after. She got a horse on a Saturday morning while the crew was out working and rode north along the dry creek bed for nearly 2 miles before she reached the old Alderman fence line, a rusted wire fence strung between wooden posts that were gray and cracked with age, running east to west across the landscape in a line so straight it felt like a statement. Clara dismounted and walked along the fence. On her side, the creek bed continued dry. Beyond the fence, on the Alderman side, she could see where the bed should have continued, and she stopped. On the other side of the fence, there were more posts, newer ones, not gray and cracked, but darker, heavier timber, sunk deep and running roughly parallel to the creek bed for about 20 feet. The wire between them was strung low and tight, and it had been reinforced, she could see, with buried wooden planks, portions of an old beam, chunks of stone. Somebody had built a dam. Not a proper dam, nothing professional, but a deliberate packing of the natural channel, tightly and intentionally, designed not to be visible from a distance. The creek bed on the far side of it, she could see now, bent north, toward Alderman land, and the ground there, even through the drought, looked different, darker. The grass on that side, such as it was greener. The water hadn't dried up, it had been redirected. Clara stood at that fence line in the August heat and felt the pieces locked together with a clarity that was almost physical. Not bad luck, not drought alone. Someone had deliberately choked off the water that Black Ridge Ranch depended on, diverted it onto unused land, and waited for the drought and the debt and the slow collapse to do the rest. She stood there for a long time, memorizing the fence posts, the construction, the sight lines, the way the ground read on both sides of the line. Then she rode back to the ranch. Silas was at the corral when she came in. He watched her dismount and tie the horse, and his expression said he'd noticed she'd been gone and had some thoughts about it. I need to talk to you, she said. I figured. Not here. She glanced toward the bunkhouse, where a figure was moving past the window. Somewhere private. He held her gaze for a beat, then tipped his head toward the barn. She laid it out for him the way her father had taught her to lay things out. Facts first, in order, without interpretation, and let the interpretation come at the end. The creek bed, the 2 fence lines, the construction on the Alderman side, the deliberate diversion of the water channel. Silas stood in the barn and listened. He didn't interrupt. His face was still and hard and gave nothing away, but his hands, she noticed, had gone very still at his sides, the kind of still that isn't relaxed. You rode to the Alderman line without telling me, he said when she was done. I did. That's not what I hired you to do. No, it isn't. She kept her voice even. But someone has been routing your water onto Alderman land for years, and it's the reason your cattle are dying. I thought you should know. Silence. The barn around them smelled like hay and horse and the lingering chemical edge of last week's fire. Alderman's been dead for 15 years, Silas said finally. The property's been in dispute. Who's disputing it? Another pause. Longer this time. Vern Holloway. He's been trying to acquire it through the county, some land reversion deal. Clara looked at him. Holloway. Is that the same man who's been trying to buy this ranch? Silas's eyes came to her face slowly. Something there. Not surprise. Not quite. More like a man who has been standing in a dark room and has just seen someone else reach for the same candle. He's made 3 offers, Silas said. I've turned them all down. And every time you turn him down, what happens next? He didn't answer immediately. He looked at the ground. Then he said very quietly, Something goes wrong. Yeah, Clara said. That's what I thought. Outside, the heat pressed down on the black ridge of earth that gave the ranch its name, and somewhere in the dry pastures, a calf was lowing for its mother. The sound carried far in that kind of stillness. "Your water isn't gone," Clara said. "It's just been taken. And I think if we clear that obstruction, it'll come back." She paused. "But if it comes back, Holloway is going to know that someone found what he did. And he's not going to like it." Silas lifted his head and looked at her with those old creek eyes. "No," he said, "he won't. So we need to be ready for that." He studied her for a long moment. This woman who had arrived 5 days ago with a worn satchel and no family and no references beyond the bare facts of her experience, who had run into a burning barn at midnight and ridden out to an abandoned fence line on her own time and laid out a conspiracy with the calm precision of someone reading a map. "Why do you care?" he said. "About this place? You just got here." It was a fair question. Clara thought about how to answer it honestly. "I've been moving from one place to the next for 8 years, she said finally, "cooking for operations that weren't mine in towns I didn't belong to. And every time I started to feel like something mattered, I'd have to leave." She looked at the barn around her, the burned corner, the rebuilt stalls, the tired timber overhead. "This is a good piece of land. It deserves better than what someone's doing to it." She met his eyes. "And I'm tired of leaving." Silas Mercer was not a man who changed his expression easily, but something in it shifted, very slightly, in a way she wasn't sure she was reading right. "Get supper on," he said. "I need to think." She went to the kitchen. She got supper on, and she thought about the fence line and the water underneath it, and the man named Holloway who had decided that Black Ridge Ranch was his to take. She thought about what her father used to say about water on a dry range. It doesn't disappear. It just goes somewhere else. Find where it went, and you find everything. The land was starting to tell her something. She was just beginning to listen. Silas didn't give her an answer that night. He came in for supper, ate without speaking more than necessary, and left the table before the others had finished their coffee. Clara watched him go and didn't push it. She'd laid out what she found. The rest was his to sit with. She'd learned that about certain kinds of men, not weak men, not stubborn men exactly, but men who had taken too many hits in too short a time and had developed a particular caution about hope. They didn't dismiss new information. They just needed to carry it alone for a while before they could do anything with it. Push them before they were ready, and they'd shut down out of pure self-protection. So she let him alone and washed the supper dishes and listened to the crew wind down in the bunkhouse. And when the ranch was quiet, she sat at the kitchen table with the inventory list and a stub of pencil and worked out how long their supplies would hold. The numbers weren't encouraging. He found her in the morning before anyone else was up. She was at the stove, and the sky outside was the color of iron, and the coffee wasn't ready yet. He came in without knocking. It was his house, after all, and stood at the edge of the kitchen with his hat in his hands. "I rode out to the Alderman line last night," he said. Clara looked up from the stove. "Alone?" "Didn't want anybody else seeing it before I did." He set his hat on the table and pulled out a chair and sat down with the slow deliberateness of a man whose body had more miles on it than it wanted. "You were right about the construction. Somebody put real work into that blockage. It's not just debris." "No," she said. "It isn't." There were tracks on the Alderman side, not old, weak, maybe 2 weeks. He rubbed the back of his neck. "Somebody's been checking on it." The coffee was ready. Clara poured 2 cups and set one in front of him and sat down across the table. "So someone is maintaining it," she said. "Looks that way." "Holloway?" "Or someone working for him." He wrapped both hands around the cup but didn't drink. "I can't prove it's him. Not yet." "No," Clara agreed. "Not yet." He looked at her across the table, and in the gray morning light he looked tired in a way that went down to the bone. "If I pull those posts and clear that channel, the water might come back. Or the ground's too compacted after 3 years and it won't, and I've wasted 2 days of labor I can't spare." He paused. "And if Holloway's watching that fence line, clearing it tells him somebody knows." "Yes." "Which means whatever he's been doing quietly might get louder." "Probably." He was quiet for a moment. "You don't sugarcoat things. Doesn't help anything." He almost smiled at that. Not quite, but close. "No," he said. "I guess it doesn't." He picked up his coffee and drank, and they sat in the early quiet while the sky outside started going from iron to pale gray to the first thin wash of gold. And Clara thought about her father walking his fence lines in the dark, and how he used to say that the best decisions weren't the safe ones or the bold ones, but the honest ones, the ones you made when you'd looked at the thing straight and decided you could live with the consequences either way. "Clear the channel," she said finally. Silas looked at her. "If the water comes back, you have something to fight for, and something to fight with," she said. "If it doesn't, you're no worse off than you are now, and if Holloway comes louder, then at least you know where you stand." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he drank the rest of his coffee, stood up, and picked his hat off the table. "I'll tell Rand to pull a crew together after breakfast," he said. They went out to the Alderman fence line with 6 men, 2 wagons, and a full set of digging tools. Silas had told the crew only that they were removing an obstruction in the north drainage, nothing about Holloway, nothing about sabotage. Clara noticed that he watched each man's face when he gave those instructions, reading them the way she imagined he read cattle, looking for the one that didn't move quite right. She watched too. Burl had gone quiet in a particular way, not the sullen quiet she'd gotten used to from him, but a tighter, more internal kind of stillness. He did the work when he was told, put his back into it, didn't complain. But twice Clara caught him looking north, past the fence line toward the Alderman property. Not the look of a man curious about the land, but the look of a man thinking about something else entirely. She didn't say anything. She filed it. The obstruction was worse than it had looked from the other side. Whoever had built it had gone deep. The posts were sunk nearly 4 feet, with packed clay and stone wedged between them so tightly that pulling them required the horses and a chain and 3 men hauling simultaneously. The first post came up with a sound like something tearing, and the wet dark earth around its base smelled like old water, like something that had been waiting. "There's moisture down there," Colby said, crouching at the hole. He pushed his hand into the earth and it came up muddy. His eyes went wide. "It's wet down here. It's really wet." Rand hunkered down beside him. "How deep you think the channel runs?" "Deep enough," Clara said from behind them. She'd been watching the water table signs all morning, the way the soil color changed below a certain depth, the particular vegetation pattern on the Alderman side. "If we clear those posts and break up the packing material, the channel will find its level again. Might take a day. Might take 3. Might take never," Burl said flatly, from where he stood by one of the wagons. Clara looked at him. "It might," she said. "But the water is there. It's just backed up. Water that's been sitting in clay for 3 years isn't going to just flow again like nothing happened." "Burl," Rand said. "I'm just saying it's a lot of labor on a woman's hunch." Silas was standing at the edge of the work area. He'd been watching, mostly. Now he looked at Burl with an expression that wasn't quite cold but had no warmth in it at all. "Get back on the chain," he said. Burl got back on the chain. They worked through the morning and into the early afternoon, pulling posts and breaking up the packed material and clearing the channel by hand where the tools couldn't reach. It was brutal work in the heat, the kind of work that stopped conversation and left men down to just breathing and pushing and the occasional grunt of effort. By the time they got the last post up, Clara's arms ached from hauling debris, and everyone's clothes were dark with sweat and mud. They stood at the open channel and waited. For a long time, nothing happened. Colby kicked a clod of dirt into the channel and watched it sit there. "Maybe," he started. Then the ground made a sound. It was low and subtle, like a pressure releasing. The mud at the bottom of the channel shifted. Something moved, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, just a darkening of the soil, a spreading patch of wet. Then water began to seep through. Not a rush, not a gush, just a slow, quiet welling, working its way up through the loosened clay, spreading across the channel bed in a thin film that caught the afternoon light and held it. Colby made a sound that was almost embarrassing in its openness, a short, involuntary noise of pure relief. He pressed his hand over his mouth. Rand crouched down and touched the water with 2 fingers and said nothing for a moment. Then, "Well, I'll be damned." Silas stood at the edge of the channel and looked at it. His face was doing that difficult thing it always did, holding more than it showed. Clara stood a few feet away and didn't look at him. She gave him the moment. It'll take time to work through, she said to the air in front of her. The channel's compacted, but if the source is what I think it is, the flow should build over the next few days. The trough lines in the east pasture should start showing water by the end of the week. If the source holds, Burl said. If the source holds, Clara agreed, because she'd learned that agreeing with Burl's doubt when it was technically accurate was more useful than arguing with it. On the ride back, she positioned herself near Rand and watched Burl's back for the whole 2 miles. He rode at the rear of the group, slightly separated, and she could see from the set of his shoulders that he was working something over in his mind. That evening, she noticed him talking with Silas after supper, low-voiced, the kind of conversation that stops when someone gets close. She didn't get close. She cleaned up the kitchen and listened to the shape of it without the words, and when it ended and Burl went to the bunkhouse, she looked at Silas across the yard. He didn't come explain it to her. She didn't expect him to. But something had been said that she hadn't been part of, and the not knowing sat in her chest like a small stone. The water came back on the 3rd day. Not dramatically, not in a great surge that anyone could call miraculous. It came back the way most things came back when they'd been damaged, slowly, unevenly, with false starts and pauses that made a person doubt before it finally committed. But by Thursday afternoon, the troughs in the east pasture held 6 inches of water that hadn't been there Monday, and the creek bed in the southeast pasture was running a thin, steady thread that darkened the pale mud to brown. Silas stood at the east trough and watched his cattle drink. Clara stood a little back, giving him room. The animals came in cautiously at first, drought-conditioned, instinctively waiting for the water to disappear, and then with more confidence, pressing around the trough in a tight mass that ordinarily would have required managing, but Silas just let them be. "My father built those troughs," he said, not looking at her. "First year on the property." She didn't answer. There wasn't anything to answer. "I thought—" He stopped, started again. "After the water went, I thought the ranch was done. Just a matter of time. I kept working because I didn't know what else to do, but I'd made my peace with it. And now?" He turned his head and looked at her. "Now I'm angry," he said. It was the most feeling she'd heard in his voice since she'd arrived. And it wasn't grief, wasn't defeat. It was a clean, clear anger. The kind that came from understanding what had been done to you and by whom. "Good," Clara said. He almost laughed at that, a small sound involuntary, and he pressed his lips together against it. "You are not what I expected," he said. "Nobody ever is." He looked back at the cattle. "Rand found something this morning, out by the south water line, the long pipe run that feeds the lower pasture troughs." He paused. Someone had cut into it. Not broken, not cracked from age. Cut. And whatever they put in the line to foul the water, it's been there a while. The stone in Clara's chest got heavier. How long a while? Rand thinks 4 or 5 months, could be longer. She processed that. The timing of the livestock deaths, the cattle that had sickened for no reason the vet could name, the feed that had gone bad faster than it should have, things that had looked like accumulating misfortune now starting to look like a schedule. "There's something else," Silas said. His voice had gone quieter, and something in it made her look at him sharply. "Rand found boot prints by the cut line, recent, and when he followed them out to the east property boundary, he found where a horse had been tied up." He kept his eyes on the cattle. "Whoever it was, they came in from the east, from the county road." "Not the Alderman property." "No." "So they came in deliberately, through the boundary." "Yes." Clara turned that over. Someone who knew the property well enough to find the south water line, who came through the east boundary, which meant they'd scouted the approach. Who had been maintaining the channel blockage on the Alderman side and fouling the water lines on this side simultaneously, for months. This was not one person acting alone. This was organized. "Silas," she said his first name for the first time, and it came out differently than she intended. More direct, more urgent. "This is bigger than one piece of land fraud. Holloway isn't just trying to take your ranch. He's running a campaign, structured, planned." She watched his face. "Are there other ranches in the area that have been struggling the same way you have?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Pearson, northeast of here, sold out last year. Said the water went bad and he couldn't recover." A pause. Galt family on the South Range gave up in the spring. Same story. Water problems, livestock dying, couldn't make the debt. Who bought those properties? He looked at her. A holding company, he said slowly, out of the territorial capital. I didn't think much of it at the time. But Holloway is connected to it. I don't know that. No, Clara said, but I think we need to find out. The cattle pressed around the trough, drinking steadily, and the late afternoon light fell on the water and made it look briefly like something valuable. Which it was. Which it always had been, out here where everything depended on it. Clara thought about Burl and his conversation with Silas, about the tracks on the Alderman property and the boot prints by the cut water line, about a man with small, appraising eyes who sat at the far end of the supper table and watched everything and said little. She thought about the fire, lamp oil, Rand had said. He smelled it too soon as they hit the doors. The fire had started in the northwest corner of the barn, the corner furthest from the cook's quarters, where she slept. If she hadn't woken from the horse's sound, if she hadn't smelled the smoke early, that fire would have taken the whole barn before anyone knew it was burning. And a barn fire in summer on a cash-strapped operation, in the middle of a drought, that was another nail in a coffin that was already being built. She'd saved the horses, but someone had wanted those horses dead, and the barn with them, and she was starting to understand that the someone who had set that fire wasn't doing it for Holloway from 50 miles away. They were doing it from the bunkhouse. Clara didn't say any of this to Silas. Not yet. She had a feeling, and feelings without evidence were just noise. And she'd been raised by a man who believed that noise only made things worse. But she was going to need to be more careful about what she said in front of the crew. And she was going to need to find out what Burl said to Silas after supper and what Silas had said back. She watched the cattle drink their way through the afternoon, the creek bed running its thin line of returned water through the cracked earth, and she thought, the land has been trying to tell this story for 3 years. It just needed someone to read it. She was reading it now. And what it said was that they were nowhere near the end of this. She started writing things down. Not in any official way. She didn't have a ledger or proper documentation paper, just the back pages of the inventory notebook she'd been using for supply lists. But she started recording dates and details the way her father had taught her to record fence damage and water levels, without editorializing, just facts in order, with times where she had them. The barn fire. Date, approximate time she'd woken, the smell of lamp oil, which corner it had started in, how fast it had climbed. The water line cut. Rand's estimate of 4 to 5 months, the location on the south run, the boot prints heading to the east boundary, the channel blockage on the Alderman property, the construction style, the newer posts mixed with old ones, the tracks she'd seen on the far side, the Pearson Ranch sale, the Galt family, the holding company out of the territorial capital. She kept the notebook in her boot when she wasn't writing in it. It wasn't a hiding place she'd recommend to anyone, but it was the one place she was certain nobody else would look. She still didn't know what Burl had said to Silas after supper. She'd thought about asking Silas directly, but something held her back. Not distrust exactly, more a sense that Silas had reasons for keeping his own counsel that she hadn't yet earned the right to push past. He'd taken her word on the water channel. He'd listened when she laid out the conspiracy. That was more than most men in his position would have done, and she wasn't going to spend that goodwill on a conversation he'd have with her when he was ready. So she watched Burl instead. And what she saw made the stone in her chest heavier every day. It was Colby who gave her the first real piece of it, without knowing he was giving her anything at all. He'd taken to stopping by the kitchen after the supper dishes were done, not to talk exactly, more to exist somewhere warm and quiet before he went back to the bunkhouse. He was 19 and homesick in the particular way of young men who won't admit it, and Clara had figured out early that the best thing to do was just let him sit there and occasionally put something in front of him to eat. On a Wednesday night, 9 days after the channel had been cleared, he was sitting at the kitchen table with a piece of leftover cornbread, and Clara was putting away the cleaned pots when he said, almost to himself, "Burl's been going out at night." Clara set down the pot she was holding. "What do you mean, going out?" Colby looked up, startled. He'd been thinking out loud and hadn't intended an audience. "I mean, I don't know, I wake up sometimes, can't sleep, and his bunk's empty. Happened 3 times this week. Does he say where he goes? Says he can't sleep, goes to check on the horses. Colby picked at the cornbread. But I checked the horses one of those nights after he came back, and they were all settled. Didn't look like anyone had been with them. Clara kept her voice casual. What time? Late? After midnight? She nodded slowly, like it was mildly interesting and nothing more. Could be anything, she said. Some men just don't sleep well. Yeah, Colby said, not sounding convinced. She let it sit there. Then, does he go toward the barn or toward the road? Colby looked at her, really looked at her, and she could see him trying to decide if she was asking what he thought she was asking. He was young, but he wasn't stupid. Toward the east fence, he said quietly. Both times I saw him leave. The east boundary, the same direction the boot prints had come from. Clara put the last pot away and said, Thanks for the cornbread company, Colby. Get some sleep. He left, and she stood in the kitchen and looked at nothing for a while. She went to Silas that night, not after supper, after the whole ranch was quiet, when she was certain the bunkhouse was dark. She crossed the yard and knocked on the main house door, and he answered it with his boots still on, which told her he hadn't been sleeping either. Burl, she said. He stepped back and let her in. They stood in the main room, not sitting, both of them too taut for that, and she told him what Colby had said, and what she'd been thinking, and what the east boundary boot prints meant when you put them together with a man who couldn't sleep and went east both times. Silas listened without interrupting. When she was done, he said, That's what he told me too, after supper that night. She stared at him. Burl told you. Not directly. He moved to the window, looked out at the dark yard. He came to me and said he'd seen someone outside the east boundary. Said he thought it might be Holloway's men checking the property lines. Said I should know. He paused. He framed it as a warning. But he knew exactly where they'd been watching from, described a spot I hadn't told anyone about. The spot Rand found the horse tied up. He turned from the window. Rand and I found that spot ourselves. We didn't tell the crew. Clara let that settle. So Burl knew about it because he'd been there. That's what I think. Why didn't you? She stopped herself. You've been watching him. I needed to be sure. His voice was flat and even, but underneath it was something that had edges. He's worked this ranch for 6 years. If I accuse a man and I'm wrong, you're not wrong, Clara said. But we need proof you can take somewhere. Something beyond boot prints and timing. He looked at her steadily. What are you thinking? She'd been working on this since Colby left the kitchen. It was rough, and it had parts that could go badly, but she'd been over the alternatives, and they were worse. Burl goes east after midnight, she said, which means he's meeting someone, or leaving something, or checking on something. If we follow him, we find out which, and if we're careful about it, we do it without him knowing. That's 2 of us gone from the ranch in the middle of the night. Rand can watch the house. Silas was quiet. If Burl knows we're onto him, it accelerates whatever Holloway's planning. If we don't find out what Holloway's planning, Claire said, it happens anyway, and we're not ready for it. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, 2 nights from now. New moon. It'll be dark enough, Pate. They didn't have to wait 2 nights. The next evening, just before supper, Rand came in from the south pasture with a face that had gone tight and gray. He came straight to Silas, and Clara happened to be close enough to hear. 2 water troughs in the lower pasture were fouled. The water was black and smelled chemical, and 2 of the younger steers that had been drinking from them were down. Silas's jaw set so hard, Clara could see the muscle in his cheek working. Same as before? He said. Worse, Rand said. Whoever did it used more this time. When? Had to be today. I rode that line this morning and both troughs were clean, which meant someone had been on the property in daylight. Brazen enough, or desperate enough, to come during working hours. They lost one of the steers by nightfall. The second held on through the night, but it was touch and go, and Pruitt stayed with it until past midnight because he'd been the one who'd found them, and he was the kind of man who didn't leave a suffering animal alone. Clara stood in the barn doorway and watched Pruitt sit with the steer and thought about Holloway, a man she hadn't seen yet, hadn't met, knew only as the shape his actions made on other people's lives. And she felt something then that she wasn't entirely comfortable feeling, A cold, clear anger that had nothing impulsive in it. Not the kind of anger that made you do stupid things, the kind that made you very precise. The second steer made it to morning, just barely. Ichan. Silas didn't sleep. Clara knew because she didn't sleep either, and she heard him in the yard twice before dawn, walking the perimeter in the dark, the way she imagined he'd been walking it in his head for months. At breakfast, the crew was quiet in the way of men who had been pushed past a certain point and were waiting to see what happened next. Even Burl ate without commentary, and Clara watched him eat with the particular attention of someone watching a performance, because that's what it was now. She was sure of it. The careful neutrality, the slight delay before his expressions arrived, like he was choosing them. After breakfast, when the crew had gone out to their work, Clara sat across from Silas at the empty table and spread her inventory notebook open between them. "I want to talk about what we do with everything we have," she said. "We don't have enough." "We have more than you think." She'd been over it the night before, sleepless and methodical. "We have the channel blockage, physical evidence of deliberate diversion with construction that's newer than 15 years. We have the cut water line, with the cut being clean enough that a court couldn't call it accident. We have the fouled troughs twice now, and if we save samples of that water, we have physical evidence of poisoning. We have the timing of livestock deaths matching the contamination periods. We have 2 neighboring ranches that collapsed under identical circumstances and sold to the same holding company." She laid her hand flat on the notebook. "Silas, this is a pattern, and patterns are what investigators look for." He looked at the notebook. "What investigators?" "The county sheriff is 3 days' ride and half in Holloway's pocket. Everyone in Harlan's Crossing knows it." Not the county sheriff," Clara said. "Federal land fraud. If Holloway has been using fraudulent means to acquire frontier properties through a holding company, that's not county jurisdiction. That's territorial, and it can go federal." Silas was very still. "That's a long road." "Yes, but it's the right road." She kept her voice level. "Violence doesn't win this. Even if we ran Holloway's men off the property tomorrow, he'd come back through the courts, through the debt, through channels we can't fight with rifles." She looked at him. "We fight him with what he doesn't think we have. Documentation. Proof. A case that's too big for a county judge to make disappear." He was quiet for a long time. The morning light came through the kitchen window and lay on the table between them. "The Territorial Land Office," he said slowly. "There was a man, federal examiner, came through 2 years ago looking into the Pearson sale. I told him I didn't know anything." He stopped. "Because at the time I didn't." "Do you know his name?" "Hargrove. Calvin Hargrove." He looked up. "He left a card. I think I still have it." "Find it," Clara said. They found Burl that night. Not by following him. Events moved faster than plans. It was Cass, one of the brothers, who came back from checking the horse line around 9 and said there was a man he didn't recognize on the east property line. Not on the property, just outside it, sitting a horse in the dark. By the time Silas and Rand got there, the rider was gone, but in the soft earth by the fence post there were 2 sets of boot prints, a large set, consistent with a man Burl's size, and a smaller set, narrower, that could have been anyone. The large set went back toward the bunkhouse. They didn't confront Burl that night. Silas made the call, and Clara agreed with it. If Burl bolted, they lost their thread to Holloway's operation. Better to let him think he was unsuspected, let him keep making the meetings, and use the time to get their documentation in order. It was the longest kind of patience, the kind that costs you every hour you hold it. Clara mailed a letter to Calvin Hargrove's last known address in the territorial capital the next morning, written in her clearest hand, laying out the timeline and the physical evidence in plain language without accusation she couldn't support. She sent it with Colby, who was going into Harlan's Crossing for supplies, and she didn't tell anyone else she'd sent it. Hargrove might not respond. His address might be old. He might have moved on or given up or decided the politics weren't worth the fight. She'd accounted for all of that, but she'd also calculated that doing nothing was a faster road to losing than any gamble she could take. 4 days after the letter went out, Holloway showed up. Not in person. He sent 2 men, hard-faced, trail-worn, with the look of people who got paid to be unpleasant and had been doing it long enough that it had settled into their features. They rode in at midday, which was either bold or stupid, and asked to speak with Silas Mercer. Clara watched from the kitchen window. She couldn't hear the conversation, but she could read its shape. The two men steady and almost polite, Silas listening with his arms at his sides and his face closed down, Rand a few feet back with his hand near his belt. It lasted about 10 minutes. Then the two men rode out and Silas came into the kitchen. "Holloway's making a formal offer," he said. "Through these men. Last offer," they said. "How much?" He told her. It was considerably below what the ranch was worth, below what it had been worth, even at its most diminished. "And if you don't sell?" Silas set his hat on the table. "They said they couldn't be responsible for what happened to operations that tried to survive out here without adequate water." Clara absorbed that. It was the most direct threat she'd heard yet. Not a threat exactly, not in language a court could use, but a description of a future that was also a promise. "They know about the water coming back," she said. "Yes." "Which means Burl told them." She picked up a dishcloth and set it down again. "So they know the channel is clear and they're concerned about it. Concerned enough to come in person." "They're not concerned," Silas said. "They're testing whether I'll fold." "Will you?" He looked at her with an expression that had some heat in it for once. "No." "Then we need to move faster," she said. "Because if Holloway's worried enough to send men in daylight, he's going to escalate. And I don't want to find out what escalation looks like from him when we're not ready." She picked up the dishcloth again, realized she still wasn't doing anything useful with it, and set it on the hook. Her hands wanted to be doing something. That was the worst part of this. The waiting and the documenting and the careful strategy, when every instinct she had said, move, act, do something physical and immediate. Her father's voice in her memory, "The fastest solution is almost never the right one. The right one is the one that holds." She breathed out slowly. "We keep documenting," she said. "We keep the water samples. We catalog every animal we lose with dates and conditions. We document Burl's movements without letting him know." She looked at Silas. "And we wait for Hargrove." "If Hargrove comes?" "If he comes." Silas picked up his hat. At the doorway he stopped and stood there for a moment with his back to her. "Clara," he said. "Yeah." "That first night, when you went back into the barn for the mare." He paused, and she could see him working to put something into words that didn't come easily to him. "I want you to know I noticed that." She didn't say anything. "I've had people work this land who cared about their wages and nothing else. And that's fair. That's an honest arrangement." He turned his head slightly, not quite looking at her. "You care about something more than that. I don't entirely understand it yet, but I notice it." Then he walked out, and his boots crossed the yard in the afternoon heat, and Clara stood in the kitchen and pressed one hand flat on the table and let the feeling in her chest be whatever it was without trying to name it. Outside, somewhere in the east pasture, she could hear the creek running, thin and imperfect and hard-won, but running. Calvin Hargrove arrived on a Tuesday, 11 days after Clara had sent the letter. She didn't know it was him at first. She was at the well drawing water when a single rider came up the main trail at a pace that was neither hurried nor casual. The deliberate pace of a man who had learned that arriving too fast made people nervous, and arriving too slow gave them time to hide things. He was maybe 50, lean and weathered, with a neat gray beard and a canvas coat that had seen considerable territory. He had a federal examiner's badge on his belt, worn where it would be visible but not conspicuous. He pulled up in the yard and looked around with the unhurried attention of someone conducting an inventory. "Looking for Silas Mercer," he said. "I'll get him," Clara said. "You'd be Hargrove?" He looked at her with a slight adjustment in his expression. Surprise. Quickly managed. "I would. You're the one who wrote the letter." "I am." He dismounted and tied his horse, and Clara went to find Silas. They sat at the kitchen table, the three of them, with Clara's inventory notebook open between them and 2 mason jars of fouled water on the table alongside it. Hargrove had brought his own ledger, and he set it parallel to hers with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done a great many of these meetings and knew exactly how they needed to go. He asked questions in a specific order that Clara recognized. chronological first, then cross-referenced by property, then by company name. He didn't react to anything with visible surprise, which either meant nothing surprised him or he'd trained his face to give nothing away. Clara guessed both were partly true. When she laid out the connection between the Pearson sale, the Galt sale, and the holding company out of the territorial capital, Hargrove opened his ledger to a page that was already covered in dense, careful handwriting and tapped it once with his index finger. Meridian Land Holdings, he said. You know it, Silas said. I've been building a file on it for 14 months. Hargrove looked up. What you've described here fits a pattern I've documented across 7 properties in 3 counties. Water interference, livestock poisoning, debt pressure, and then a below-market acquisition through a corporate intermediary. He paused. What I've been missing is the physical evidence connecting the interference to a specific actor. The channel construction, the cut water line. Those are things I can take to a federal magistrate. What about Burrell? Clara said. Hargrove looked at her. You believe he's the on-property contact? I believe he's been passing information and access to Holloway's men for at least 6 months, possibly longer. She laid out what she had. Colby's account of the nighttime departures, the boot prints on the east boundary, the conversation with Silas where Burrell had known details he shouldn't have known. None of it is courtroom ready on its own. No, Hargrove agreed, but it builds, and there's something you should know. He turned a page in his ledger. Burrell Dennett, before he came to work for you, said, does that name mean anything? He looked at Silas. Silas frowned. Just Burrell. He never used a last name that I recall. Dennett, Hargrove repeated. He worked for a land brokerage in the capital 3 years before he showed up here. A brokerage that was quietly absorbed by Meridian Land Holdings 18 months ago. He let that sit for a moment. He's not a man who got pressured into betraying you. He came to you with this purpose already in mind. The kitchen was very quiet. Clara watched Silas take that in. 6 years, he'd said. Burrell had been on this ranch for 6 years. He'd eaten at that table, drawn that pay, sat across from Silas in the yard on slow evenings. And for some portion of that time, maybe all of it, he had been a planted instrument pointed at the ranch's heart. Silas's face did not collapse. It went very still and very hard, the way stone goes when a crack runs through it, but the whole thing holds together from sheer habit. I want him off my property, he said. His voice was level. I understand, Hargrove said, and we will. But not tonight, and not in a way that tips Holloway that we've connected it all. If Burrell disappears suddenly, Holloway pulls his men back and we lose the operational thread. He looked at Silas steadily. I need 3 more days to get 2 deputies from the territorial marshal's office down here. When they arrive, we move on Burrell and on Holloway's men simultaneously, so neither can warn the other. Silas looked at the table, at the jars of fouled water, at Clara's notebook with its careful handwriting, at Hargrove's ledger with 14 months of other people's losses recorded in it. 3 days, he said. 3 days. And in those 3 days, if Holloway moves again, then we document it and add it to the warrant. Hargrove closed his ledger. Mr. Mercer, I know what I'm asking you to sit on. I've asked other people to sit on the same thing, and I know what it costs. He paused. But the only way this ends permanently, not just for Black Ridge, but for every property Meridian has been circling, is if we build it right. Silas was quiet for a long time. Then he looked at Clara. She didn't tell him what to decide. She just looked back at him steadily. 3 days, he said again. And this time it wasn't a question. Mom. Those 3 days were the hardest stretch of the whole thing. Harder than the fire, harder than watching the cattle sicken, harder in some ways than any of the physical danger. Because this was the patience that required performing normalcy while knowing exactly what was underneath it. Clara cooked 3 meals a day and kept the kitchen routine unchanged and spoke to Burrell with the same even neutrality she always had. And every time she did it, she felt the effort of it like a low physical weight behind her sternum. Burrell was watchful. She'd always known he was watchful, but she could feel him recalibrating. The 2 men Holloway had sent had come and gone with their ultimatum. Silas had refused to sell, and now everyone was waiting to see what Holloway's next move would be. Burrell was waiting for the same thing, but from the inside. On the second night, she woke to the smell of smoke. She was out of bed before she was fully awake, feet on the floor, window open, and she could see it east of the main house. Not the barn this time, but the feed storage shed, a thin column of smoke, just starting. She didn't shout. She pulled on her boots and ran. The shed was padlocked, which meant whoever had started it had done so through a gap in the boards or through the roof. She could see now it was the roof, a small hole where something burning had been dropped in. The fire was small yet, but the dried feed inside would take fast. She got the padlock off with a rock and the key from the hook by the door. She'd memorized where every key on that property hung 2 weeks ago, because she was that kind of person, and got the doors open and started pulling feed sacks out before the smoke got thick. She'd gotten 4 sacks clear when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned. Burl was standing in the yard, 15 feet away, watching her, not moving to help, just watching, with that particular expression she'd cataloged and filed and now understood. "You gonna stand there?" she said, breathing hard. "Or are you going to help?" He didn't answer. He looked at her for a moment with something in his face she couldn't entirely name. Not guilt, not quite, more like a man who has been playing a role for so long he can't remember what the alternative looks like. Then he turned and walked back toward the bunkhouse. By then Rand was there, and Colby and the brothers, and they got the rest of the feed out and smothered the fire with the dirt they kept in buckets by the barn for exactly this purpose. The shed's roof was scorched, but the structure held, and the feed was mostly saved. Silas appeared at her shoulder when it was over. "Burl didn't help," she said quietly. "I know. I saw." His voice was like iron that had gone cold. "One more day." "One more day," she agreed. Ban. Hargrove came back on Thursday morning with 2 men from the Territorial Marshal's office. Younger than she'd expected, both of them, but they had the look of people who were competent and knew it without needing to perform it. One of them, a woman named Deputy Alcott with dark hair and a direct way of looking at things, reminded Clara of herself enough that it was faintly unsettling. They sat with Hargrove and Silas and Clara for an hour, going over the sequence and the roles. Then Hargrove laid out how it would go. Silas would send Burl to the east pasture alone on a routine errand. Deputy Alcott and her partner would intercept him at the boundary fence, where the evidence of his nighttime meetings was still readable in the ground. At the same time, Hargrove would ride to Harlan's Crossing with the county sheriff, who, it turned out, was not as fully in Holloway's pocket as everyone assumed, having been quietly cooperating with Hargrove's federal investigation for the past 6 months. And Vern Holloway would be arrested at his property outside of town on a federal warrant for land fraud, conspiracy, and interference with water rights. "It'll be loud," Hargrove said. "He'll have lawyers on it within a week, and those lawyers will be good ones. This doesn't end today. It begins today. But it begins from a position where he can't suppress it or buy it quiet, because it's federal and it's on record." "What about the properties he already took?" Clara asked. "Pearson, the Galts." Hargrove looked at her. "That's part of the case. If the acquisitions are proven to have been obtained through fraud and criminal interference, there are remedies. It's not simple, and it won't be fast." He paused. "But it's possible." She nodded. She hadn't expected simple. It went roughly the way plans went when they were built on real information rather than hope. Mostly right, with the parts that weren't right being exactly the parts nobody had controlled for. Silas sent Burl to the east pasture to check a stretch of fence that needed replacing. Routine enough to be unremarkable. Burl took it without visible suspicion, saddled his horse, and rode out. Clara watched him go from the kitchen window and felt something complicated move through her that wasn't quite satisfaction and wasn't quite relief. Deputy Alcott and her partner were already at the boundary fence when he arrived. What happened at the fence, Clara heard about from Colby later, who had positioned himself on a rise with an excuse about checking the water level in the east trough, and had seen most of it. Burl had pulled up short when he saw the deputies, and there had been a moment, Colby described it as a man doing a fast calculation, and then Burl had tried to turn his horse around. He hadn't gotten far. The deputy's partner had anticipated it. When they brought Burl back through the yard, his hands were bound in front of him, and his face had gone to something flat and blank. He looked at Clara as they passed her, and she looked back at him, and there was nothing either of them said. She thought about 6 years. About a man who'd eaten at that table every day for 6 years, sleeping in the bunkhouse, riding out with the crew, watching the operation deteriorate and doing his part to make sure it kept deteriorating. She thought about what kind of arrangement made that worth it, what Holloway had promised or was paying, and she found she couldn't feel contempt exactly, though she'd have been entitled to. What she felt was something colder and sadder, a man who had made a choice early and followed it so far he'd lost sight of what he was choosing against. She went back to the kitchen and started lunch. Hargrove returned to Black Ridge at 4 in the afternoon with the county sheriff and 2 additional deputies. He stopped in the yard and came to find Clara and Silas together, which by now was where people expected to find them both. "Holloway's in custody," he said. His 2 men, the ones who came to deliver the offer, were arrested at his property this morning. They had a significant amount of documentation on them. Something in Hargrove's expression shifted. Not quite satisfaction, more the look of a man watching a case complete itself. Account records, a letter of instruction regarding Black Ridge Ranch, correspondence with Meridian Land Holdings. He paused. And a payment ledger with Burl Dennett's name in it going back 5.5 years. 5.5 years. Clara did the math. Burl had arrived at Black Ridge 6 months before the payment started. 6 months to establish himself, earn the position, get close enough to be useful. "What happens now?" Silas said. "Federal warrants are served on Meridian Land Holdings. The company's accounts are frozen pending investigation. Anyone connected to the land acquisition scheme will be interviewed." Hargrove looked at Silas. "Your water rights. The channel, the diversion onto Alderman property, that goes into the record as evidence of criminal interference with a water claim. It becomes part of the federal filing." He paused. "Your water rights are effectively confirmed by that filing." Silas was quiet. "It doesn't mean the debt is gone," Hargrove said more gently. "It doesn't mean the cattle you lost come back or the feed. The damage is real, and some of it you'll carry." He seemed to want to be honest about that. But the thing driving the damage has stopped, and the record is clear. Silas looked out at the yard, the repaired barn, the horses in the corral, the line of the east pasture where the creek was running. His hands were at his sides. Clara could see the tension in them, the slow release of something he'd been holding for a long time. "The water rights," he said finally. "My father filed on that water channel, 1861. He stopped. "I spent 3 years watching his work disappear." "It didn't disappear," Clara said. He looked at her. "It was taken," she said. "That's different. Taken things can come back." He held her gaze for a moment, and then he looked away. And Clara thought she saw something in his face that she'd never seen there before. Not relief exactly, more like a man slowly setting down a weight he'd forgotten he was carrying. Hargrove stayed for supper and ate with the crew, who had gotten the news by then and were in various states of loud disbelief, quiet satisfaction, and in Colby's case an inability to stop grinning that lasted well into the evening. Rand sat at the end of the table with his coffee and said almost nothing, but Clara caught him looking around the table at the crew, 5 men now, with Burl gone, with the expression of someone recounting something they thought they'd lost. Even Pruitt, who had bad knees and very little sentiment, allowed himself a second cup of coffee. After supper, when Hargrove had taken his leave and the crew had drifted back to the bunkhouse, Clara was alone in the kitchen finishing the dishes when Silas came in and stood in the doorway. "I keep going back to the barn fire," he said. She looked at him. "That first night, I told myself it was probably accident and lamp oil, and then you said it wasn't, and you were right, and I still kept half thinking it might be accident. Because the alternative—" He stopped. "It's harder to accept that someone does something like that on purpose, deliberately, to people who haven't done anything to them." "Yes," Clara said, "it is." "Does it get easier, accepting that?" She thought about it honestly. "No, but you stop being surprised by it, and that helps a little." She set the last dish on the shelf. "The surprise is what paralyzes you. Once you're past that, you can work." He was quiet, looking at the shelf of dishes like he was looking at something else entirely. "You saved this ranch," he said. Clara shook her head. "The water saved this ranch, and you didn't sell when you had every reason to." She picked up the dishcloth and hung it on its hook. "I just read what was already there." He looked at her then. really looked, with that same careful attention he gave to things that mattered. And she looked back, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Outside, the creek ran on in the dark, quiet and steady, over the stones her father had probably never seen, and Silas's father had filed water rights on in 1861, doing what water did when you got out of its way, finding its level, following its course, making everything around it a little more alive than it had been. The weeks after Holloway's arrest didn't feel like victory, not right away. Victory, Clara had learned over 30 years of living through things, was rarely a feeling that arrived clean and complete. It came mixed up with exhaustion and the particular flatness that followed long periods of sustained tension. The way a body that has been braced for impact takes time to understand that the impact is over and it can stand down now. The ranch felt that way in the days that followed, like something that had been holding its breath and was only slowly remembering how to exhale. The crew felt it too. The morning after Hargrove took his leave, men showed up to breakfast quieter than they'd been the whole time she'd known them. Not sad. Something more complicated than sad. Colby ate 3 helpings of eggs without once saying anything that required a response. The brothers, Cass and Tom, sat across from each other and communicated entirely in looks the way they always did, but the looks were slower, more reflective. Rand drank his coffee and stared out the window at the yard with the expression of a man taking an accounting he wasn't sure he was ready to finalize. Pruitt said, "You think they'll actually make it stick? The federal charges?" "Hargrove thinks so," Clara said. "He's been building it for 14 months. Lawyers have a way of making things that should stick slide right off." "They do," Clara agreed. "But this one's in federal record now. Holloway can't buy it quiet." Pruitt grunted. It wasn't agreement exactly, but it wasn't argument either. Coming from Pruitt, that was close to optimism. Well, Silas rode out alone that first morning before the crew had finished breakfast. Clara watched him go from the kitchen window, north toward the Alderman fence line, the same direction she'd ridden on her own 3 weeks ago with nobody's permission but her own. He came back 2 hours later and came into the kitchen and stood at the table without sitting down, turning his hat in his hands. "The channel's running stronger," he said. "I know. I checked the East Trough yesterday. The flow's up about 1/3 from last week. The lower pasture's going to need work. The ground's been dry so long it's not absorbing right. We'll have to break it up and reseed." He set his hat on the table. "I want to ride out to the Pearson property next week, see how it's sitting." He paused. "Hargrove said if the fraud case holds, there may be grounds for the county to revisit those sales. Pearson might want to know that." Clara looked at him. "You're going to go tell him yourself?" "Somebody should. He's been sitting on whatever Holloway paid him for a year knowing it wasn't fair. That kind of thing eats at a man." He looked at the table. "I know what it's like to sit on something that isn't fair and not have any place to put it." She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "That's a good thing to do." "I'm not doing it to be good," he said, a little roughly. "I'm doing it because it's right and because it needed saying." "I know," she said. "That's what I meant." He looked up at her, and the roughness in his expression smoothed out slightly. He picked up his hat. Then he set it back down and stayed where he was, like he'd decided to say something and was working out how. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to answer it straight, not the way you think I want to hear it. When have I ever answered you the way you wanted to hear it?" That almost got a smile. "Never. That's why I'm asking." He looked at her steadily. "Are you thinking about leaving?" The question sat between them, quiet and specific. Clara had thought about it, of course. Not in the way of wanting to leave, but in the way of every person who has spent years being temporary. A habitual checking of the exits, a reflex toward impermanence that had been built over a long time and didn't dissolve just because circumstances changed. She'd thought about it the morning after Hargrove left, lying on her cot listening to the creek run, turning the question over the way you turn over a stone to see what's living under it. What she'd found under it had surprised her a little. "No," she said. He waited. "I told you why I came here," she said. "Nowhere left to go, not much left to lose. That was true when I said it." She looked at the kitchen around her. The iron stove she'd coaxed back into reliable function, the shelves that were properly stocked now, the window that faced east and got the morning light. But it's not the reason I'm staying. What is? This place matters, she said simply. To you, to the crew, to the land, in whatever way land can matter to itself. She looked at him. I'm tired of being in places that don't matter. This one does. And I had a part in keeping it, which means it's got a part of me in it now. She paused. That's not something I'm inclined to walk away from. Silas looked at her for a long moment. The morning light was coming through the window behind her, and in it she could see how much the last weeks had cost him. The lines in his face, the gray that had advanced at his temples, the particular tired quality of a man who has been fighting a slow war and has only recently understood that he's going to survive it. I'd like you to stay, he said. Not the way a man offers an employee a renewed contract, the way a man says a thing he's been carrying around and has finally decided it's better out than in. I know, Claire said. I'm staying. Warmed. October came to Black Ridge the way it came to all high-range country, sudden and serious, with a cold that arrived in the nights first and then started pressing into the days, turning the dry grass from gold to something closer to rust. The creek ran steadily through it, which was still something that made Clara stop and look at it sometimes. This thin, unremarkable thread of water that had cost so much to recover and ran now like it had never been interrupted, indifferent to everything that had happened around it. The herd that had been depleted and sickened through the spring and summer began to stabilize. They lost 2 more cattle in September to complications from the poisoning that had already done its work. The sickness had been in those animals longer than could be undone, and Clara and Silas and Rand had to make peace with that loss as part of the final accounting. It wasn't simple, making peace with it. Rand was harder about it than he let on, going quiet in the evenings with a particular set to his jaw that Clara recognized as grief wearing the costume of practicality. It wasn't your fault, she told him one evening when the crew had gone in and they were the last 2 in the yard. Wasn't it? He looked at the pasture. I should have found that water line cut sooner. Should have been watching closer. You were watching, she said. Burl was making sure you looked in the wrong direction. That's what he was there for. Doesn't make those animals less dead. No, she said. It doesn't. He was quiet. Then, how do you let go of it? The part that was your fault, even when most of it wasn't. She thought about that honestly. You don't let go of it, she said finally. You just add it to the weight you carry and figure out how to carry that weight without letting it make you stupid. She looked at him. You've been on this ranch a long time. You know what it needs. That's worth more than the mistakes, as long as you don't let the mistakes convince you that you don't know anything. Rand looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once and went inside. She stood in the yard and watched the stars come out over the black ridge of earth on the north horizon. The night was cold and still, and somewhere in the dark pasture she could hear cattle moving, unhurried, calm, the sound of animals that were not sick, not frightened, just living. The letter from Hargrove came in November. It was 3 pages, dense and legal in its language, but clear enough if you knew what you were reading. Meridian Land Holdings had been formally dissolved by court order pending the fraud investigation. 4 of Holloway's associates had entered plea agreements in exchange for testimony against the primary case. Holloway himself had hired the lawyers Hargrove had predicted, and the case was moving through the territorial court system at the pace these things moved, which was slow and sometimes infuriating, but moving. The important part was on the second page. The water rights claim on the Black Ridge Channel had been officially recorded in the Federal Land Register, with the diversion onto alderman property listed as criminal interference in the court documents, which meant those water rights were not just Silas's claim anymore. They were on federal record, protected in a way that a county judge couldn't touch and a corporate attorney couldn't quietly bury. Clara read that paragraph twice. She handed the letter to Silas across the breakfast table. He read it slowly, the whole thing, without speaking. When he was done, he set it down and looked at it for a moment. It's not over, he said. No, it'll take years to fully resolve. Holloway might walk on some of it. He might, she said, but not on the water rights. Those are in federal record now. Whatever else happens, you keep the water. He looked at the letter. My father would have wanted to see this. She didn't have anything to say to that, so she didn't say anything. Colby, who had been making a determined effort to look like he wasn't reading the letter from across the table, said, "So we're okay? Like, actually okay?" "We're actually okay," Clara said. He exhaled like he'd been holding it since August. The thing nobody tells you about a ranch coming back from the edge is that it's not one moment. It's a series of small, unglamorous ones that accumulate over months into something you can only recognize in retrospect. It was Rand rehiring 2 men in late October to handle the work that Burl's absence and the recovery had created. Not young men looking for temporary work, but experienced hands who came, recommended, and stayed because the operation felt solid again. It was the supplier in Harlan's Crossing reinstating their account without being asked, which meant word had traveled in the way that words traveled in small frontier towns. And the story of Black Ridge Ranch had changed in the telling. It was the morning Clara noticed the corral fence had been repaired. All of it, properly, with good timber, and asked Silas when he'd had that done, and he said he and the brothers had done it on Sunday, because it needed doing and there was finally time to do things that needed doing instead of just things that were on fire. It was a small thing. It meant everything. She started teaching Colby to cook. This had not been planned and was not, initially, his idea. He'd come into the kitchen one morning looking for something to eat before the rest of the crew was up, and she'd put an apron on him before he could object and told him he was making biscuits. He'd protested, miserably, for about 10 minutes, and then he'd gotten interested, the way young people get interested in things when they stop trying not to be. He was bad at it at first. The first batch was dense enough to use as wheel chocks. But he kept coming back, and Clara kept teaching, and by November he could produce a passable biscuit and a serviceable pot of beans. And he was inordinately proud of this, in the way of people who have discovered that the thing they thought was beneath them is actually something they like. "Why are you teaching him?" Silas asked one evening, watching through the kitchen doorway as Colby concentrated intensely over the stove. "Because I won't always be the cook," Clara said. Silas looked at her. "I'm not leaving," she said, before he could ask. "I mean, I want to do more than cook." She met his eyes. "I've been thinking about the South Range, the ground that dried out. If we broke it up right and reseeded in the spring, we could run another 30 head by summer, maybe 40. She paused. "I'd like to work on that." He looked at her for a long moment. "You want to help run the operation?" "I want to do useful work," she said. "The cooking is useful. There's other work that's more useful." "You're not wrong," he said slowly. "I know I'm not wrong." "You're also not easy," he said, but there was something in his voice that wasn't complaint. "No," she agreed. "I'm not." He looked at the kitchen, at Colby over the stove, at the inventory notebook that Clara had moved from her boot to the shelf beside the window, at the repaired stove and the properly stocked shelves, and the small, accumulated evidence of a place being cared for by someone who intended to stay. "South Range in the spring," he said. "You and Rand work out the plan and bring it to me." She nodded. "That's all I'm asking." The last snow of autumn came on a Wednesday in late November, just a dusting that didn't stick past noon but turned the Black Ridge of the North Hills white for a few hours and made the ranch look like a photograph of itself. Clara stood on the porch in the cold and watched it melt and thought about how different the same piece of land could look depending on what was happening underneath it. She'd been thinking lately about her father, not with grief exactly. That had softened over the years into something more like conversation, the way she carried his voice in her head and let it weigh in on things. She thought about him walking his fence lines in Kansas, head down, looking at both sides. She thought about his hands, which had been large and rough, and had known their way around every kind of ranch problem she'd ever encountered. She thought about what he told her once, when she was about 12, and frustrated with a fence repair that wasn't coming together right. A good fence isn't about the wire. It's about the posts. Get the posts right, and the rest follows. She'd always thought he was just talking about fence. She understood now that he was talking about everything. Silas came out of the house and stood beside her on the porch, looking at the snow on the ridge. He had a cup of coffee in each hand and offered her one without looking at her, which was the kind of gesture that had become unremarkable in the way that comfortable things become unremarkable, present and steady and not requiring comment. She took the cup. They stood there for a while, drinking coffee in the cold, watching the white on the ridge dissolve back into dark earth as the temperature climbed toward midday. "I've been thinking," Silas said. "About what?" "About what this place is supposed to be." He looked out at the pastures, the repaired corral, the barn with its replaced north wall. "I spent the last 3 years thinking about how to keep it. Just keep it, not lose it. That was the whole goal. Don't lose it." "That's not a small goal." "No, but it's not enough of one." He turned the cup in his hands. "My father built this place to be something, not just a cattle operation that survives, something that lasts. That means something to the people on it and to the land around it." He was quiet for a moment. "I lost sight of that. I got so focused on not losing it that I forgot what I was supposed to be building." Clara looked at the ridge. "You were fighting for it. That's not the same as losing sight of it." "Maybe." He looked at her sideways. "But I need someone to remind me. When I get down in the mechanics of it and forget the larger thing." "Is that a job offer?" "It's an honest assessment of what I need," he said. "Make of it what you want." She looked at him. This difficult, closed-off, capable man who had taken 3 years of deliberate destruction and had not sold, had not quit, had gone back out every morning and worked a dying operation because he didn't know how to do anything else and hadn't yet accepted that it was dying. Who had taken a 30-year-old stranger's word about a water channel nobody else had noticed and gambled what he had left on it. Who had said, "I want you to stay," like it cost him something to say it, because for him it did. She was not a person who romanticized things. She'd had enough of life to know that the feeling in her chest right now was real, and also that it would require work. The same kind of work everything worth having required. Not the dramatic, crisis-driven work of the last 2 months, but the slower, quieter kind. The kind that built things over years. She was, she realized, looking forward to it. "You know what your father's mistake was?" she said. Silas looked at her. "He built this place by himself, or close to it." She looked out at the land. "That works until it doesn't. Until the drought comes, or the money runs short, or someone like Holloway decides he wants what you have. One person can't hold a thing like this alone." She paused. "It takes people who care about it for reasons of their own, not just employees, people who have something of themselves in it." "Like you," he said. "Like me," she said. "Like Rand. Like Colby, who is in there right now overcooking beans for the 4th time and will eventually figure out how not to." She looked at him. "That's what you're building, not just a cattle operation. A place where people do their best work because they give a damn about it." He was quiet for a long time. The snow on the ridge was almost gone now, just a few pale patches in the shadow of the rocks. "My father would have liked you," he said finally. "He sounds like a man with good judgment." That got it. The smile she'd been catching the edge of for weeks, finally arriving fully. It changed his face in a way that made him look younger and more tired at the same time, which was how genuine smiles worked on people who didn't use them often. "He had good judgment about land," Silas said. "People, he was less reliable." "Well," Claire said, "I'm part land." He looked at her. "I mean, I grew up on it," she said. "It's in me. The way I think, the way I read things. You hired a cook and got a woman who thinks like a ranch." She turned the cup in her hands. "Maybe that's what this place needed." "It's what I needed," he said. Quiet and direct, the way he said things when he decided to say them instead of carrying them around. Clara looked at the ridge, fully bare now, the snow gone, the dark earth back to itself. Unchanged, old, present. She thought about water that runs underground for decades and never stops existing, just waits for someone to remove what's blocking it. She thought about all the years she'd spent moving, and how she'd always told herself she was looking for somewhere to land, but the truth was she'd stopped believing she would. Somewhere along the way, the looking had become the thing itself, and she'd made her peace with impermanence the way you make peace with a wound that doesn't fully heal, by learning to move around it. She was done moving around it. "I'm staying," she said. Not to Silas, not exactly. More to the land itself, to the ridge and the creek and the pastures and the dried grass that would green up in spring when the water reached it. To the decision, made out loud, in the cold November air, so that it was real, and not just a feeling she'd keep to herself. Silas didn't say anything. He stood beside her on the porch and drank his coffee, and the cold came off the ridge and moved across the yard, and the creek ran on the way it always ran when you stopped stopping it. Black Ridge Ranch stood in the late autumn light, imperfect, debt-carrying, short two hands, with a barn wall that still smelled faintly of smoke if you got close to it, and it was the most solid thing Clara Bennett had ever put her hands to. That was enough. That was, in fact, more than enough. Some things are not saved by dramatic gestures or perfect plans. They are saved by people who show up, who pay attention, who read what the land is saying and trust what they know, even when nobody else does. By people who run into fires when the sensible thing is to run away, and who sit with the evidence in a notebook and wait for the right moment, and who stay when they could leave because the leaving would cost something that isn't replaceable. Clara had learned that from her father, who had learned it from the land itself, which had been teaching it longer than any of them had been alive. The creek ran, the cattle grazed, the ranch breathed, and the woman who had arrived with nothing but a worn satchel and a name nobody recognized stood on the porch of a place that now had something of her in it, and watched the afternoon come down over Black Ridge, and was, for the first time in a long time, exactly where she meant to be. End of part 5. End of story.